Okay, so kind of just looking at research and information needs is more of a statewide or area view to it that may be specifically on certain fish or certain operations. So kind of, tackling some of these issues, and we were just talking about them, is economics. And as I mentioned yesterday, one of the more common phone calls I get, oddly enough, are from banks, loan agencies, agricultural financing operations, and they ask the same questions. They say, essentially, can you provide examples of successful either aquaculture or aquaponic operations, because I've received applications for loans and we need to compare them. On the aquaculture side, there's some examples that you can provide them. I mentioned yesterday on the aquaponics side, it's very, very difficult because each operation tends to be unique. And to say, when I ask them, what do you mean by successful? They say, well, who's been in business for 10 years or more? And I showed you the graph yesterday that essentially most aquaponic operations have been in operation for 5 years or less. So it's still an issue. And I haven't put the picture up there. And Carol, I'll leave the rest of that discussion to you. All right. As I said up there, aquaponics operations, they're new, they're diverse, and they're unique. I kind of, when I talk about this, talk about the 12 minus 6 minus 3 scenario. And that was last summer, there was an article in the Chicago Tribune. And they had a surge of aquaponic operations, commercial ones, opening up within the city limits of Chicago. And in the past 5 years, 12 businesses opened up. And again, these are commercial, medium to large scale size within the city limits. What the article referred to is they said, here they are looking at them 5 years later, and 6 of them have gone out of business. And of the 6 that are remaining, 3 of them have switched over to purely hydroponics. Right, so that basically leaves 3 left. So 3 out of 12 over a 5-year span within the city limits. It's not a great track record, actually, if others are looking to get into it. And then, of course, the economics can also extend to the fact that foreign imports are one of the toughest competition. They mostly come in cheaper. And we went through these stats yesterday. 90% of the U.S. seafood is imported, a huge trade deficit. The one that I always usually scare audiences when I talk, as I say, and then the FDA has only inspected about 2 to 3% of those imports. So what are they containing? On the social side of it, the fact is, and even looking at this list of species we have up here, U.S. consumers still like high-valued fish. Right? We talked about a little bit yesterday, farming down the food chain for fish that are lower, that are more herbivores, and yet U.S. consumers generally don't head in that direction. We also see the fact, and I think it popped up here, is that seafood choice remains more of a local decision. I was speaking with some people, we were talking about kind of yellow perch and walleye. And it's interesting that yellow perch are popular in Wisconsin, everything from the Wisconsin River east, and walleye are popular Wisconsin River west. Right? So it's a very local decision, and we see consumers making those choices. And then, of course, all that conflicting consumer information that's out there. Is it healthy? Do they contain contaminants? I'm really surprised when I get contacted by reporters. They say, well, we hear there's a new aquaculture operation opening up in this city in Wisconsin. Can you describe how these mega farms operate? And I usually say, what's your definition of mega? I mean, this is a mom and pop operation that's opening up. Where do they get that from? Well, they just search the internet and look at news articles, and that's what you see out there is how these mega operations are ruining the environment. And they really don't look more into it. And then, of course, there's the pollution component, and we were talking a little bit about that yesterday with phosphorus and other discharge. On the political side of it, permits and regulations, these are tough. I threw a couple of statements up here. I mentioned yesterday that Wisconsin's, I don't want to say is embattled right now, it's actually looking somewhat positive this year, but it's the second year that the Wisconsin Aquaculture Association is trying to get the statutes changed in the government. You were just mentioning how it's defined here in Minnesota. In Wisconsin, I mentioned yesterday, aquaculture is not defined as agriculture. Right? It's regulated by 2 separate departments there of natural resources and agriculture. And they have a bill right now that's supposed to kind of clear that up. They're going to try to firmly plant aquaculture under agriculture, which opens up a lot of possibilities to them. Primarily the one they're concerned with is water source and use. But I just basically brought up one of the Wisconsin newspapers, and these are the headlines over the past 2 months in there, and it says, Assembly Bill aims to ease regulations on the fish farming industry. And then it says another one, state regulators should be careful what they wish for because they're going to wind up drilling drilling high capacity wells and draining all our aquifers just to support these fish populations. So others came in and said fish farming won't harm Wisconsin waterways. So there's a lot of back and forth taking place right now. I can never with politics predict what the outcome looks like. It looks somewhat positive, but who knows how it's going to turn out. And again, Carol, I'm going to leave it up to you, but she has the great article that came out recently about the cost of regulations. And it's a significant cost for aquaculture operations to get started and keep going. On the flip side of it, you'll see a bullet point that says new businesses. And that is whatever politicians I talk to, oh, they would love aquaculture. They see it as a rising industry, and they see how it opens up new jobs, boosts the economy in their local areas. So there's this conflicting information coming out in which they want to regulate them and keep them confined, but they want the industry to grow because it creates jobs. And I'm not sure how that's going to be resolved. And then, of course, on the political side, you have to put research funding in there. We're all sitting around here, currently, what's the idea is that Sea Grants funding is going to be eliminated. Right? And we have to build a wall instead of feed people. So that's been popping up, as you can see, even in Wisconsin, with the Sea Grant, contacting all the stakeholders saying, you got to fight for us to keep us around. Fish nutrition, it's a big issue that a lot of people talk about, that whole concept of less fish meal, more plant meal. A lot of that has to head in the direction of species-specific diets. There's very few of them that are actually out there. There's been some reports that have come out saying for U.S. aquaculture to be competitive with the foreign markets, we have to keep optimizing the production of fish. One way to do that is to create species-specific diets that optimize growth and nutrition. Starter diets, we have a lot of trouble with that with those walleye and saugeye. There isn't a specific starter diet for those fish. We're in the process of trying a variety of types. We talked about this yesterday, less fish meal, more plant meal. I just put this up here. If you haven't actually read this article, I found it kind of a nice counter argument to that. And that is in the article, what they said is everybody likes this concept of less fish meal. Stop getting the wild fish and feeding them to farm-raised fish. This article went in and said, well, keep in mind, you're going to replace it with plant meal. What's going to get planted? More genetically modified crops to turn them into fish meal, into the meal for the fish. Also, what the article talked about is it actually double or triples the carbon footprint of aquaculture, because now they've got to farm those, they've got to irrigate them, fertilize them, harvest them, process them, ship them all over. And it was if you haven't read it, it's a nice article actually that throws up a little bit of a counter argument to this whole push to plant meal diets instead of fish meal diets, saying, we haven't actually thought about the other half of the argument there and what impact it's actually going to have. I mentioned yesterday organic. It struggles to get aquaculture, aquaponics listed as organic with the U.S. government. And I also mentioned the fact that a lot of aquaponic operations, the vegetables they're producing are essentially going into the markets to compete with the organic produce that's there, not the mass market soil-based produce. Generally, those are a lot cheaper than even what aquaponics can raise it. And then nobody's mentioned this one here, but how about probiotics? There's a definite large push in Europe to introduce and utilize probiotics in fish diets. In the U.S., it's kind of at the research stages at this point, people just kind of dabbling in it. And then there's environmental risk and the issues surrounding that. We talked a little bit about it yesterday. I just found it kind of interesting when you go to look up information on the effort by Michigan to put net pens into Lake Michigan. You'd think Michigan newspapers would pop up with the stories. It was actually the Washington Times had the largest article all about it, and how groups were out there quite strongly saying we're not going to put net pens into the Great Lakes. So that's kind of an environmental risk if they're there. It's also a political argument. I keep mentioning, just because I'm familiar with it, about Wisconsin, and that is what's some of the conflict taking place with this legislation is that basically it's a fight over who gets to use the water, where does the water go. And we've had quite a number of articles coming out talking about the fact that the aquaculture wants to deregulate it so they can tap into high capacity wells. Currently, only a agriculture identified farm can actually tap into high capacity wells. Fish farms are having a very hard time tapping into those as well, but that's because they're not listed as agriculture. And then, as I said up here, they want to define it as agricultural operations for more freedom, but it's, they've had quite a number of organizations from the Wisconsin Wildlife Foundation to Sierra Club come in and speak out against it, saying, no, don't classify them as agriculture, because then they can use more water and they can discharge more waste. So it's not a done deal, it's a battle that continues. Generally, people say that it's low environmental risk for aquaponics because it's a contained system. I'm actually working with a grower right now in Montana, in which he's in the process of building his aquaponics operation. But now he's deciding halfway through constructing it, all right, what fish and plants should I raise? Right? That's when he contacted me. I'm sort of like, oh no, that's the question you should have answered a year or two ago before you started construction. But it's been very interesting. The regulatory agencies in Montana don't want him to open up an aquaponics operation. They essentially said to him, first and foremost, you're not bringing tilapia into Montana. So then he said, well, what about sunfish? What about bass? And they basically said, we won't give you a permit if you try to raise those species. And I don't know where Alan is, but I was talking with him yesterday, and he called me on Monday of this week, and he said, well, the Natural Resource Agency in Montana came back to him and said, they'll issue him a permit tomorrow if he decides to raise fathead minnows in aquaponics. And he called me and said, well, what do you think? Should I go for it? And I'm sitting here saying, let me start creating the list of the ways and reasons you should not do that. So, why is Montana being resistant to it? Is that they basically list environmental risk. It's too dangerous for them to bring in these species and raise them, even though it's a closed containment system. But that's their view of it right now in Montana, is that they don't want aquaponics. Speaking of aquaponics, I mentioned some of these yesterday, and that is difficulties that a lot of these growers have run into. The zoning one I mentioned yesterday, and it wasn't, an easy process. I followed closely both Milwaukee and Chicago, and it started out as a very simple concept. Those cities have the city areas zoned not for agriculture, and they view aquaponics as agriculture, which is what it is. It's a form of farming. So in both cases, Milwaukee and Chicago, it was more than a 2-year process to get the zoning regulations changed for certain areas or districts within the city. Right? Again, keeping in mind that for aquaponics, a lot of the draw is the localvore, see where your food is processed, low distance to transport your crops. Urban aquaponics, the concept is popular, but getting into production is difficult. And zoning is one reason, and another, of course, I've talked about are loans. Right? I've mentioned competition before. Who are you competing for trying to sell your products? Lots of times it's the organic market. We talked a little bit about coupled and decoupled systems. Right? A lot of people are looking at tilapia and saying it's a low valued fish. I want to make a lot more money off of my fish, so therefore I want to go with the higher value, the salmonids, the cool water, cold water fish. Problem with aquaponics is it's a full circulating system, usually within inside of a greenhouse. It's tropical conditions. Right? So now if you're putting a cool or cold water fish in there, you've got to heat and chill the water. And I have many discussions with potential growers in which they're saying, well, I'll use geothermal, I'll use solar. It's still an expensive add-on to try to heat and cool your water. So now the concept is with decoupled, you kind of run the plants and the fish separately with a small connection between the two of them to influx those nutrients, and maybe a way of actually going around that. I always talk about diversification of crops, both plants and fish in aquaponics. There's no formal study, but some informal data that's come out shows that about 90% of the U.S. aquaponics industry raises tilapia. Okay? We could probably, especially with the fish biologists here, argue reasons for and against doing that. I'm not the biggest fan of tilapia, but essentially 90% of an industry is dependent upon one fish. Right? Pick a disease. I don't know, Nick, pick one disease. And it affects tilapia, and 90% of an industry could collapse overnight. Right? So I keep talking to people saying, what other crops? Of course, we're trying the walleye and the sawguy, but there's plenty of other fish that can be tried within these systems. The other aspect, and it ties into what we're talking about here, is nursery providers. 90% of that industry is really buying tilapia fry from 3 providers. Okay? That's not a lot. What else when you go to other species such as a walleye? There are no nursery providers right now. So people say to me, hey, your results are really good, I want to do that. And I'm like, well, good luck. I don't know where you're going to get your eggs and fry from. Right? It's the next step in the evolution of some other crops, is to provide this industry with the fish that it needs, when it needs it, so out of season spawning. And then the other one, which can't be ignored that I have here, especially when it comes to aquaponic operations, they cannot and will not buy their eggs or fry from outdoor growers. It's a huge biosecurity risk as to what those eggs and fry are bringing into the operation, and since it's so tightly integrated, as soon as that disease is in it, everything dies. So basically, they not only want more nursery providers, they not only want out-of-season production so they can get their eggs and their fry, but they want the nursery providers to be all indoor operations. Right? That adds another level of complexity to all of this, since that's not true for a lot of other species of fish. There just aren't indoor sources. So we get those diseases, and then I mentioned this yesterday with the enthusiasm exceeds knowledge right now. And that is, there's very few people out there that understand the full concepts and workings of aquaponics, and therefore they need science-based education. I tell this to the class that I teach, the students in the class for aquaponics, and it's just an example that hits home. I came home one day and my neighbor across the street had a semi parked in his yard, and they were unloading all these metal pipes. And over the next week or so, a greenhouse popped up on the property. And I thought, oh, that's kind of nice. It takes away from the neighborhood a little bit, but there's a greenhouse there. The next week, another semi pulled up, and all these blue poly tanks suddenly rolled down to the truck. And I stood there saying, are you kidding me? Is my neighbor going to do aquaponics? He hasn't spoken to me, about it at all. He knows me. So I just stood back and said, maybe he wants to do it on his own. Over the next couple of weeks, I saw activity coming in and out, hoses and things. And it was only short, 3 to 4 months later, all these blue poly tanks rolled down to the greenhouse and were stacked up by the side of the road, and I think he was putting a free sign up on them. So I figured at that point, let me go ask him, what's happening? And he says, I heard all about this aquaponics and the craze. I wanted to do it. So I set it up. And he says, I got the fish in, I got the plants in, and then it collapsed. He says, I lost all the fish, then the plants died. He says, I don't understand it. And I said, well, where'd you get your design? Where did you learn the information? And he said the words I hated to hear. I must have watched between 40 to 60 hours of YouTube videos. And I said, well, that's not this. Right? Most of those videos are put up by do-it-yourselfers, which is great. They're proud of what they're accomplishing. But it can't be replicated, and they're not telling you the full picture. What I was sad to hear is he said, yeah, anybody who wants to buy that? He says, I'm out $30,000. And I thought, holy cow, he blew $30,000 in 4 months. And that's it, gave up on it. And the reason was he got his education from YouTube. Right? So keep that in mind. That's where people are looking for this information.
So did you grab him, Chris?
I don't know. Felt that would be kind of nasty to. I'll take him. Here's $1. So then the funding was the other point to raise here too, and that is funding's needed for everything. This is not a well-developed industry. We've got lots of questions still hanging out there. We haven't really even talked about, even though we've got them in the room, all the fish health questions that are out there, the pharmaceuticals, the concept of biosecurity. I preach that left and right, and that is the best way to deal with diseases is to prevent them from ever getting onto your farm, and that's the most important aspect. And once they're there, then you got problems you have to deal with. Aquaponics, I was telling this to some people last night actually at the social, and that is that I've submitted probably about 6 to 8 federal grants for aquaponics, and 1 got funded. The other 6, essentially that came back rejected, came back with the comment saying, you're really raising plants, not necessarily fish. They're an insignificant component, so this is really a version of horticulture while you're submitting it to the fish agencies. Right? Well, they've got a good point there. The money side of aquaponics are the plants. Right? There's a lot of operations that raise the fish at a loss and not even making money off of them. Right? So we have to kind of change that view a little bit because it's slowing down the actual aquaculture side of aquaponics to get these additional species, to get these sources of fish into the system. And then as I mentioned already, diversification. It's an industry that really needs to diversify as quickly as possible, that's way too reliant upon tilapia at the moment. We've talked about diets, less fish meal, starter diets, species specific. I mentioned yesterday that early larval fry stage is really a black box of a lot of fish species, getting them onto food, getting swim bladders inflated, stopping cannibalism at that level. It's very common in a lot of those fish. Ante-season is necessary. Right? Growers want eggs or fry when they want them, not when the spawning season is coming around. So getting them to ante-season spawning is important. as I was just mentioning, education, training the current workforce, new techniques, new species, diversification. But then, of course, with my role at the university, I'm heavy into educating the next generation. I don't know where Greg is. We've talked about this before, and that is what's the average age of a fish farmer in Wisconsin? It's got to easily be in the 50s or early 60s. Right? Where's the next generation coming in to replace them? Okay, there's very few of them that are actually interested in it. Right? To them, it's not an easy way to make $1 million overnight. Right? So we've got to educate the next generation. Somebody's going to produce all this food. Sustainability, I think Steve's going to cover a lot of that as well with the recirculating. And of course, I mentioned economics. But this is one that popped up in our small group yesterday a little bit. We didn't talk about it too much. And that is, you can produce all the fish that you want, but if nobody wants to buy them, what good is that? So consumer education, the whole area of social science also has to be tackled. You can look into all the science of producing fish in different systems, but you've got to educate the consumers so that they want to buy what you're selling. So I just want to wrap this up, a little personal plug here, and that is, as you've heard us, that in Wisconsin, UW-Stevens Point has the Northern Aquaculture Demonstration Facility. Those of you that haven't been there, it's in northern Wisconsin in Bayfield, and this is an overview shot of the facility. We've got ponds, we've got flow-through, we've got wetlands, and then we have a big building that has our recirculating aquaculture systems in it. We try to use this to help address some of these questions, everywhere from work that Emma does with the social science and outreach and education to producing and trying different species. I've mentioned this, and as we opened up 2 years ago, a sister facility called the Aquaponics Innovation Center. Essentially, it's this greenhouse building here. It's got a classroom, and then it's got 6 replicate, kind of small commercial scale aquaponics systems in it so that we can do some research. That's one of the things that's missing in aquaponics as well. I know Nick showed yesterday what he has here. There just really isn't many research facilities for aquaponics across the US. So it's something that the industry needs. And then I put this up here just because it ties in what I was just saying, educating the next generation. And that is that we're trying to address that at our university. We have an aquaculture minor, and very proud of this one too. We have over 90% job placements for our graduates. A lot of places say, I can't believe you have undergraduates who are trained in aquaculture. That's usually graduate level studies for it. And then we also have aquaponic college courses. We offer 3 of them. For the past 6 years, we've actually had over 400 students register and go through the courses. One of the things we developed a year and a half ago was a professional aquaponics certificate, which is a series of courses they need for their training. We actually got it approved by the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, so a lot of the returning vets can come in there and take the program. And it's new, it's only a year and a half old. We've had about 7 students go through it, and I'm kind of proud of the fact that all 7 upon graduation got snatched up by aquaponic businesses instantly. So there's a need for educated people to help run these systems. And we also participate in a master class with Nelson and Paid, and that's had over 1,400 students from 101 countries actually go through it over the past 10 years. So there's a need for education out there. I think that's a really important area to address as well, not just the production, but who's going to run these things, right? And what background do they have? So I'm going to wrap it up there.
Thank you. Perfect.
Yeah.
So as far as the zoning in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the Twin Cities, we went through what's called Homegrown Minneapolis, and it's very clear about zoning issues as far as urban agriculture and where it's allowed. So as it stands in Minnesota right now, there's a pretty clear path forward to accomplish, from a zoning standpoint.
Yeah.
So
that's actually the best news I've heard. I know Madison, Wisconsin's going through it right now as well, converting old buildings. And there's a lot of negative aspects that people are bringing up with it as well, that they don't want it.
Right.
So I'm glad to hear that.
Well, the only restriction is residential in
okay.
the Twin Cities, right? They just don't want a giant aquaponics facility in someone's neighborhood.
Yep, it glows all night long. Yeah.
Has the aquaponics industry encountered problems with Streptococcus aureus and tuberculosis in the tilapia? That's why the decoupled system would be better.
I have not heard of those specific diseases. I do think that there is a hidden side to aquaponics and that they're suffering fish diseases. And you know, what I find is they call us at the university saying, help, all my fish are now swimming upside down. And I mean, they're typical aquaculture diseases,
Right.
but they lack the tools to address them because they can't treat the sick fish in the system itself.
Yeah.
But again, it kind of goes back to the statement I made, and that is that what I'm finding is the aquaponic growers don't have a fish culture background to them. So they have no idea. I'll ask them on the phone, describe the symptoms of the fish, and they don't even know how to do that.
I wasn't thinking so much about the fish being sick, but one case of people getting Mycobacterium or Streptococcus and having one or more people who have developed those illnesses, humans developing these illnesses from the tilapia that may or may not have contaminated the vegetables.
Yep. There's a study, a NICRAC study going on right now that Nick's part of and another professor at Stevens Point is, in which they're sampling the bacteria throughout the system to see what's actually present there. Yeah. So hopefully we'll find out soon.
We'll take one more question from John, then we do need to move on.
So Chris, wonderful talk, thanks a lot. And you gave a huge list of needs. And you know, my problem is I want to create an RFP and I want to give out $1 million to help Minnesota aquaculture industry. What do you think are the maybe one or two most critical needs right now to help this industry develop?
Well, the first one that comes to mind is the one I threw up there, and that is consumer information, consumer science, letting them understand the benefits of aquaculture or farm-raised fish. It's interesting, whenever I just talk to general public at speeches, more than half of the people have been, in some cases I'll say, brainwashed into thinking wild are better, that's the way to go, farmed fish are not good for you. So that would be the first one. The other one's a little tougher because then I would lean more on a production side, and I guess it depends on how it turns out, what's the fish or the system most important to Minnesota.
Things like optimizing, maximizing growth rates or something like that?
Yeah, and then like I said, kind of then the nursery provider, if these fish want, you know, the farmers want eggs or fry on a season, it's a tough one to find.
Thanks.
Yep.